Hello, this is Georgina Rose,
This is Nike.
This is Anthony.
and welcome to Magnolias and Magick. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a concept that I discovered through a book. I found out about this book through the YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast. They did a video on it, and I read the book, and I thought it was very cool. But we're not going to be talking about the book. We're going to be talking about the concept that the book is based upon, so you don't need to have read anything. We're not a reading show. We do suggest reading, but we're not a book club. And that would be the myth of disenchantment. The myth of disenchantment is basically a term for the common conception that the belief in religion, magic, spirits, gods, and simply enchantment, that can mean a lot of things. People believe in different things that would be in this category. This doesn't necessarily mean like God or Yod-He Vau-He. This could literally mean like the Fae, ghosts, anything beyond the sort of terrestrial, logical, rational world basically people think that's died. There's a really good quote about Kabbalah that Kabbalah is the vengeance of myth after being pronounced dead for centuries by rationalists, right? And so a lot of people think that all this stuff is dead. We're in the age of rationality, logic, facts. That God is dead, right? But that's not really true. That's actually not true at all. And this is the argument against that. We get this idea that, like, we're in this rational, hyper-logical world because we think of things like the Enlightenment or the fact that less people go to church and assume that that means our world is disenchanted. But I think that's not an accurate way to view if people are spiritual or not at all. As well, I think this idea that there's some hard dichotomy between rationality and mysticism is also not entirely true. And so we're going to explore that. We're going to explore ways that spirituality survived. Why does mainstream society actually view spirituality as irrational? Why do we see belief in magic as something that completely contradicts, logic? If they're at odds at all, and what made us believe, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about modernity. So, let's break into it.
I think that the argument that we're living in a disenchanted world is a very new atheist kind of viewpoint, because it's with new atheism, and this isn't about atheism in particular, although I'm sure it'll be a large theme throughout because of just what the topic is. New atheism seems to focus entirely on Christianity, especially modern Christianity, and so it tends to be this view, this myth of disenchantment, this view that because people aren't going to church, like Georgina mentioned, therefore belief in myth, belief in spirituality, belief in God or gods is fading, and in reality it's just people stepping away from the church as an institution. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are less religious generally. I mean, we saw the rise of witch talk and paganism over the last few decades, of course, but in particular over the course of the pandemic, we saw a lot of people getting driven towards it and opening up into it anew. This new fresh idea and new fresh interest in paganism. So I think we definitely can say that there's not people being disenchanted. I think the more we modernize, the more we want to connect more with nature and are becoming fascinated once again by gods, by spirits, by ancestors, by magic in general. All those things to connect us back to our human roots.
Yeah, I mean, we've become and I think the modern time has a lot to do with what we're seeing with witch talk in particular, because we become hyper individualistic, we become hyper tech driven, we become hyper consumeristic, and people lack identity. They're finding identity in all sorts of things, and they feel disconnected. We become very alienated as people, and to sort of remedy that, people have started returning to our roots and our thoughts and our history and what spirituality could be. Also, this idea that spirituality has always been measured by church attendance just doesn't make any sense, because when we look back historically, Christianity is not the oldest religion in the world. And I think if these new atheist types were to view like older spirituality, say when Europe was pagan, when Europe actually was pagan, I don't think they would call that like rational and secular. I think they would take an issue with that too. And so this idea that Christianity is the only way to measure this is also wrong when you look eastward. Like Eastern societies have very different religious practices, but those aren't not enchanted just because they're not the same. I think this idea that spirituality is a church-like structure is just wrong, because there's so many different ways that religion and spirituality has manifested across cultures and across the world over history that I don't even know why church attendance is the number one thing we're considering. If we were having a discussion about, say, Christianity's influence on modern culture, then sure, I think that would be something to consider. But when we're talking about broader, like, enchantment, broader spirituality, like, absolutely not. people are just as esoteric and spiritual as they kind of always have been. People, I think, on a deep level crave meaning and purpose. I think people don't want to live soulless lives, right? Like we have this whole trope of like, you know, the 9 to 5 trope of like someone who goes into the office and goes home and is like really depressed. Um, like that is something that I don't think anyone wants to do. And I think like the idea of that is very crushing to people, and so people are always going to seek more meaning. That isn't always religion or spirituality how people do that, but I think people on a deep level want more. People want something bigger. They want something more than just the grind.
Well, and 2 points that I wanted to bring up too. We talked about this a little bit in one of our previous recordings. I don't remember exactly what topic we were covering, but we were talking about how over the last couple of years, the pandemic and like just the political landscape and like all the crazy stuff with the climate, all the crazy stuff on just like the wars and like the disease and like everything that's been going on the last couple of years. That's what it was. We were talking about consumerism and witchcraft. That's what it was. And we were talking about throughout all of that difficulty throughout the last couple of years, it's driven people to find more meaning and find frameworks where they can find better ways to deal with all of that and cope with it. And especially like what you're talking about, I hesitate to say in modern times because it's mostly just like in America I hear this criticism a lot, but like we kind of glorify that idea of like waking up every day, going to work, doing your 9 to 5, like coming home, doing your side hustle, whatever, like living this secular lifestyle that's based around like materiality and like developing material relationships, developing like financial stability. Like we kind of glorify that, but that is very good for being productive, but it's not very good for handling crazy bigger things, like bigger emotions, like things that come with the pandemic or everything else we've seen. And so like I totally get what you mean by people needing to find, like they don't want to live a soulless life. Like they need some kind of framework to deal with all of the extra shit that comes along with the human experience besides just like wake up, go to work, go to school, come home, go to sleep, repeat. But within that too, like another point I wanted to bring up, I think this touched more on what Nike was saying, this idea that we can only measure like enchantment in the world through like our relationship to Christianity. When I was going through some of the source material, especially by the author of the book we're talking about, he reemphasized a lot that this idea that modernity equals disenchantment is very, very heavily coded in the Western world. And it is very exclusive to like the sources quote that support it are very exclusive to like Western science or like Western religion. But like even beyond that, it's not just Western society. I hesitate to say this because I'm not an expert, but like it feels like a white problem, or it feels like an upper class white problem in a lot of ways. Because like I grew up in an Asian and a half Asian and a half Hispanic family, and we had shitloads of enchantment, like all throughout our community growing up. Like my entire Mexican side of my family actively believes in the evil eye, and like we have some members that are Catholic, we have others that are atheists, but like everybody believes in La Malocchio. Like I have a lot of relatives that will still do like egg cleansings before they'll take their kids to like the doctor and stuff like that. And then on the Asian side of the family, like ancestor veneration is still a thing, even within like I said, within atheist parts of the family or within Christian parts of the family or in Buddhist parts of the family. And so it just depends on what lens you're trying to look for enchantment through.
I want to talk about the Enlightenment because a lot of this, like, because modernity is really built on Enlightenment values, right? And we talk about like, modernity as a term, we're talking about what happened after the Enlightenment most of the time. And the Enlightenment was the beginning of rationality. It was the beginning of, you know, a lot of our modern cultural values in the United States are Enlightenment values, right? And the Enlightenment was not really the end of spirituality. I mean, when the Enlightenment ended was like right when the Victorian spiritualist movement started, which I find very interesting because all the Enlightenment was about we are rational, we are about discussion and discourse. And the Enlightenment, love it or hate it, is sort of the foundation of a lot of modern culture. But the second the Enlightenment ended, you notice spiritualism. And I think spiritualism is important to discuss because spiritualism was a movement in Western Europe that was sort of a predecessor to a lot of modern spirituality, right? Spiritualism was basically people doing seances and calling up ghosts. And it was considered like by a lot of the ceremonial ordered occultists at the time, saw it as like the lower form of spirituality. Kind of like how if you talked to like a Thelemite, they would probably scoff at you for mentioning Moldavite, kind of like that. But spiritualism was wildly popular across Europe. As well, this was the time when theosophy and Hermeticism were returning. And so there was actually this, like, pretty much right at the foot of the Enlightenment, this entire Victorian occult revival, like, immediately started. And I don't know why you would say spirituality ended at the Enlightenment when there was literally a spiritual revival, like, 10 years later, basically. Like, it was really close succession these two things happened. And did Enlightenment values actually seep into this revival? Yes, because let's look at scientific Illuminism. So the Crowley had this idea that was kind of popular at the time called scientific Illuminism, and that was using the method of science to get the aim of religion. And that is kind of the post-Enlightenment idea, right? That we're going to use this method to get the end, or as Blavatsky said, the highest form of religion is truth. So there was this idea that finding religion was seeking out truth through these methods. So even back then, it's not like these two were opposed, really. Like, this Victorian revival, which was a massive spiritual revival, it was equivalent to now with the, like, rise of witch talk or whatever, if you want to put it like that. It was, right at the feet of this. And did it incorporate some of these scientific ideas into it? Yeah, because it was different, right? Like, the Christianity that preceded the Enlightenment and this revival were very different. They thought differently, and you can see this modern Enlightenment idea in these movements. But yeah, I mean, it's not like Enlightenment led to this, like, new atheist 200-year period. Like, that's not what happened. Like, it's a very weird premise, because did the Enlightenment lead to the rise of secularism? I would say yes. Yes, it did. But it didn't kill religion. It didn't even kill religion in Western Europe. Like, we're saying this is not true outside of the West, and I would agree that this phenomenon does not apply to the non-Western world, this idea of disenchantment, like, no. But even in the West, like, that's not even true. It's just, like, kind of true in ways. Like, it's I feel like, just looking historically, you can see these movements happening right afterwards and be like, yeah, maybe not.
Right. Well, I mean, in his book, Dr. Josephson Storm, he mentioned this very specifically. I thought this was a really good point too. That exactly what you're saying, actually. That before the Enlightenment is what gave us this idea of modernity, and that's what he said his work was mostly about in the book, was tracing back to find like the academic lineage that created this language and this concept we have of modernity and like disenchantment. And the conclusion he came to was that it was a cherry picking of a handful of writings from a handful of very specific academics, like usually philosophers or sociologists or things like that, that were giving commentaries about how shitty they thought society was, and saying essentially like, yeah, rationality is here to stay, science is the way to go, like God is dead, like Nietzsche's famous quote, like God is dead, and things like that. But that wasn't the consensus of like all of academia during that time. It was just a retroactive handpicking of a couple specific academics. And at the time, and even preceding the time of the Enlightenment, like we have the entire grimoire tradition that comes through Western occultism for most of like the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. And then after that, we have like Newton, who like he discovers laws of gravity, but then he also talks about like divination and like all kinds of occultism, like all of these like, and that's what he talked about in the book too, is like all of these very specific scholars who did, like Nietzsche even, like who did talk about like God is dead and we live in a world of disenchantment. Even some of them like actively practiced occultism or like astrology or things like that. Like the supernatural was a well-established part of Western academia. And then like once the Enlightenment happened, apparently for many different reasons, people just didn't like that, or like at least the people in control of the popular narrative didn't like that, so they retroactively tried to remove the occultism out of science, and then just declared like, oh, by the way, like we are a modern society now, which makes us better than all of the other second and third worlds that like surround us, and like we don't believe in silly things like magic and religion.
Well, it's so funny. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned astrology. Like, we have modern presidents, like, from this day and age, who had official presidential astrologers. Like, clearly, we're not disenchanted. Religion has as strong of a stranglehold as it ever has, especially in politics. It's not gone away. Just because I think a lot of the view as well. Part of this view of disenchantment is the view of which religion actually is real and actually matters. And it's this idea that no one can actually believe that, right? Like, politicians don't actually believe in this stuff that strongly. They're just doing it for a means to an end. And it's like, no, they do often believe this stuff. Not all of them, I'm sure. I'm sure some of it has to do with money. But a lot of politicians still today, especially in America, very much have their religion tied into their political shit. And I think it's this unfathomable idea to new atheist types that they just can't understand that people genuinely believe this stuff with their whole hearts, that they fully do, and they're not just doing it for money. Like, they do believe in it. And so to even think that disenchantment has any legitimacy to it is to completely misunderstand some of the motivations behind a lot of what is going on in the world today. You have to look all over globally. You have to be incredibly ignorant and very much like an ostrich sticking your head in the sand to have whatever belief you want to have, to think that it's a disenchanted world when religion has never gone away.
Well,
Right.
also, of course your religion is going to color everything you see. Of course it does. I don't know why this is a shocking thing. Your religion often has to do with your values, your core values as a human being.
Mhm.
And so those are going to color everything you do and like all your choices. There's no like divorcing that from what you're thinking and what you believe. It's just it's impossible to do. And also I want to talk about Nietzsche for a second.
Mhm.
People get Nietzsche so wrong.
Oh
Okay?
yeah. Oh
The
yeah.
quote "God is dead" by Nietzsche is not an atheism is based quote.
Yeah, it's not at all.
Nietzsche as a philosopher is someone that I like. Hot take. I'm pro Nietzsche. But can we please leave the 14-year-old emo boy interpretations of Nietzsche in the past, okay? Nietzsche is very complicated, and when he said God is dead, he meant something quite different. It was not what that quote is meant to be. And also, to say Nietzsche was opposed to all religion is really not correct.
Mhm.
I mean, Nietzsche deeply inspired like multiple religious thinkers, right? Crowley was wildly inspired by Nietzsche and takes a lot of Nietzschean ideas into Crowley's theology. Like the way that Nietzsche talks about the will and the way that Crowley talks about the will are quite similar. There's actually quite a few ideas within Nietzsche that are actually kind of spiritual. If you actually like sit down and read Nietzsche and don't read 14-year-old emo Nietzsche interpretations, I say we give Nietzsche a little bit more love than just being like, yeah, he's the guy who said God is dead, and also he's a nihilist, so that means that life sucks.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Well, that's
wrong.
That's part of that coding thing that the author of the book we're talking about. That's part of the coding that he was talking about, like people retroactively going back and like taking away all of Nietzsche's actual points and then like transposing this lens of like, oh, he thought that like God is dead and the world sucks and like modernity is here to stay, and like that's not true whatsoever. Like another big example that was talked about, I don't think this was in the book, I think this was in a lecture I was listening to by the author, but he was talking about how there's specific like markers for not specific markers, but like this whole idea in academia is very abstract, but like there's these repeating markers that people sometimes use to say like this is when modernity began, and one of them is when Freud and Jung came in and like revolutionized like modern psychology, and people use them to say like, oh yeah, no, like that's when we completely got rid of like magical thinking, like people think about like, yeah, this is like actual science.
Sorry, I have to laugh if you're putting Jung and getting rid of magical thinking in a sentence together.
And that's what I'm saying. Like Freud believed that you could see the future in dreams. Like he actively studied clairvoyance. Jung actively believed in astrology and used like astrological archetyping like all throughout his research. Like, yeah, and that's what the author was getting at, is like even our modern, like not modern, but like within the last 150 years, like major historical scholars who like we credit with creating our modern world, like they were deeply entrenched in the paranormal a lot of times too.
Jung is barely even like I think calling Jung like a rationalist is just hilarious, because Jung was so deeply inspired by mysticism. If you've ever sat and looked at Jung, it's so mystical, it's almost barely even scientific, right? Like quote unquote scientific. I like to describe Jung as this: he's too scientific for occultist, too occulty for scientist. That's where he falls. And his work, you cannot detach that from spirituality, right? Like the life, death, rebirth cycle, the archetypes. Like, those archetypes are some of the key things in the modern neo-pagan movement. Like, Jung's archetypes are so deeply entrenched. His idea about the collective unconscious is not a fucking not a secular idea. I don't know how you can secularize that. And even Freud, first of all, a lot of people don't give Freud that much credit these days. Freud is very controversial for a lot of reasons, some good, some reasonable. I will say this, TikTok has vindicated Freud, just because if I ever hear the word mommy in my TikTok comments again, I think I'm just going to start believing Freud. I gotta be honest, like, every time someone comments mommy on my TikToks, I just, like, internally, I'm like, you know what? I always thought Freud was a dick. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's right about a few things. Anyways, even Freud, like, he was kind of quirky. I would not really call him, like, the modern, rational, like, face of science.
Yeah,
like,
at all.
Freud was something. He was a character. He's doing his own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he's not exactly, like, I don't know. He's an interesting choice. So those two representing the beginning of rationality is just funny to me.
Right.
Because those guys were kind of just... This thing about psychology, to be honest, psychology is a very baby science.
Mm-hmm.
We really don't know that much about the human mind. Like, I'm going to be honest, psychology is the baby of the sciences. And so I don't see that one as a good beginning of rationality, because at this thing, we barely understand psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we really don't. We're still getting there, and I think I'm not, like, dogging psychologists, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's something we're learning about. I think that the beginning of any era is kind of a vague thing to try to figure out, right? You kind of have to guess around. But yeah, I mean, our science also, even modern scientists have been spiritual. I want to talk a second about Jack Parsons.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most important Thelemites is Jack Parsons, who has been written out of science. He actually is a crater on the back of the moon and is completely eradicated from almost every single NASA website. Interesting, isn't that? But he invented the fuel that got humans to the moon. He invented jet propulsion. I've done entire videos and podcasts on him. He's brilliant. And he was a Thelemite, and he was a dissident. He was very out there for the time. He was very critical of a lot of things. And because he spoke his mind, and because he did the hymn to Pan, I'm dead serious, he did the actual hymn to Pan in front of all his fellow scientists before his rocket test. And interestingly, at the time, he was seen like a crazy person. So he actually did not have a degree in what he did at all. He had to drop out because he didn't have money. And he ended up inventing this stuff by doing these crazy tests in his backyard that all the other scientists looked at him like, you're going to kill yourself. Which he did die in an explosion. I mean, maybe they weren't wrong about that one. If he killed. I'm just saying, I'm not going to go full conspiracy. I'm just saying, I think the death is suspicious. I think it's very suspicious. I'm not going to go any further. I'm just going to say, you can do your own research. But he was doing all this stuff, and everyone looked at him like he was crazy. Everyone's like, you want to get us to space? That's not going to happen. We're not going to get to space. What are you talking about? They actually told him that the idea of humans getting to the moon was something out of science fiction. They, like, laughed at him. They're like, you're this crazy religious nut who's doing these rituals and calling up Aleister Crowley all the time, and we don't want you involved with us. And he had to do so much work to get funding, and he invented the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And you want to know what that is now? NASA. Mm-hmm. And you know how he got all these ideas? The occult. Multiple of his actual scientific theories came from ideas about alchemy. Like, I'm dead serious. Mm-hmm. I did a podcast on test tubes and colleges about this. They know the science a bit better than I do because they're actual scientists. But yeah, most of these literal scientific theories come from modern occultism. That's how he got his ideas. And, you know, he got us to the moon. Mm-hmm. So to say that, I think part of this idea that, like, he was written out of history does kind of connect to this larger thing, because there's no way to even look at him without acknowledging the fact that he's an occultist. Mm-hmm. And he was written out of history, but he was so important. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
I mean, this is just like a tidbit, but like another example I remember from when I was in biochem was there's a scientist, his name is I had to look it up. It's Friedrich Kekule, but he was a scientist in the 60s, 70s, give or take, and he was the one that he was one of the founding fathers of our modern understanding of like chemical bonding, and he specifically discovered the shape of the specific molecule called benzene, which is like very, very, very fucking important important for biochemistry. And it's weird because it's one of the first molecules we've ever discovered where the molecules or where the atoms create a ring shape. And like for a long time, it was very confusing to like a lot of scientists. They didn't understand why it behaved so strangely because they didn't understand. They never even thought of the concept of a molecule being in a ring shape. And then one day, this guy Kekule, he was a very light student of occultism, from what I understand. But one day he had a dream, and he had a dream about the Ouroboros, like the snake eating its tail, and that was where he got the inspiration for like, oh, it's a circle, and then like it revolutionized modern science. And so like, yeah, no, like occult, and that's what a point that the author made in the book we're talking about a lot too, is like occultism has always informed scientific discovery, like at least like maybe more so in like the 1500s, like up to like the 1800s, but like even nowadays, like you're saying, like occultism has always been a branch of learning that for whatever reason has fascinated academics, and the two go hand in hand a lot.
The thing that I find fascinating is people trying to divide them as if they have to be separate, when for a long time a lot of these occult concepts were considered sciences. Astrology
Right.
was a science. Like, it just was. Alchemy is a science, technically. Like,
Mhm.
you can look at history and see what things we've decided suddenly are no longer science. They're not worth studying. They're silly, goofy, spiritual things and don't belong in science. I mean, hell, there's people that don't think psychology is a science. They think that
Yep.
that's like goofy, whatever. It's funny when I see people trying to say this is science and this is not science, because, well, it's science or not science now. But what is it going to be in 100 years? What is it going to be in 500 years? Are we still going to consider this science and this not science? Is it going to swap back? A lot of these concepts just are determined on what we think of as a science and what's not a
Absolutely.
science, and determining what we think is valid. Some of it has to do with many different cultural norms and stereotypes and what have you. But I mean, it's science itself is not even a really well-defined thing, because you can apply the scientific method to magic. I certainly know that I apply the
Yeah.
scientific method to
Scientific
like magic practice.
illuminism.
Yeah, like I use the scientific method for testing out spell work. If I want to test out these ingredients and see how well it goes, I'll swap things out and see if it's any better, try out different timing. Like, a lot of it is very scientific in the approach. So what makes the dividing line between science versus magic? Why is one valid and scientific and one is not? And when you add this tiny little extra element, why does that make it this or that? Like, if it's measurable versus not measurable, where some parts of science aren't really measurable. If you consider psychology a science, it's not super measurable. It's just whatever your bias is.
But also, what are we treating science as? Because the science, this is the thing. I always kind of laughed at this idea that science has become a new god. I was like, that's some crazy, crazy take. But it's not. It's not. Why do we, with science has been wrong in the past. Science is a method. Science is not an ideology. It's literally a method of discovering things. And we discover laws, we discover theories, but theories are subject to change. And multiple times we have believed hard scientific truths that have not been true. Science is evolving, and an important part of science is challenging ideas. Science is about being able to question things and discovering things through that process. And so we teach science as this dogmatic thing and like it's a hard truth. That's just not correct. Science is evolving and growing, and if people don't question things, science is not going to change. All of science has begun with people questioning things and thinking about it. So I think this also is like, what has science become? Because I think for some people, science is less of a method and more as an ideology or religion almost. It's like how I've said certain people have made political ideologies their substitute religions. I think for some people, science has become their substitute religion. And I don't think that's a healthy way to view science, because we need to be critical of what scientists are doing. Because there's a lot of problems in industries that are scientific, especially in the US. I can think of like the Tuskegee experiments. The beginning of obstetrics has a lot of really bad abuse. Like, there's been problems within the scientific field. I think science is important. I think medicine is good. I think I go to the doctor. I take meds. But I think we should remember that science is not a god, and science is ever evolving and changing, and we need to be critical of what we're consuming and what we're around, and ask questions about things.
Well, and the another example that I can think of really quickly is like I remember in high school, one of the first things we learned in my sociology class was about the American eugenics movement, like back in like the 1910s up to the 1950s, 60s, 70s in some cases in some states, where like the popular scientific opinion of the time was that different races have different biologies, and like white people are perfect and non-white people are pretty damn stupid, and things like criminal behavior, like propensity to like murder people, like various things that are undesirable by society, were in fact like linked to genetic factors, which then led to like forced imprisonment and sterilization of like hundreds of thousands of people, which eventually bled into the entire creation of Nazism. Like, yeah, and the reason that that was perpetuated for so long, like I was saying, we learned in sociology class, was because people just believed scientists blindly. Like science is this almighty, like you're saying, this almighty new uh not infallible, I guess infallible, yeah, this infallible god that like we just can't question if we are rational upstanding citizens. But like that's not the case. Like scientists are people with their own agendas, like
And many things we believe now, we're not going to believe in like 50, 60 years, right? Like one scientific idea that's really influential in occultism is Humeric medicine. The idea that we have humors, and that those have certain qualities and traits. This is actually really influential on certain metaphysical ideas, because basically the idea is that you have to balance the humors in your body, and if you can balance those, you'll be healed. This is how I believe a lot of metaphysical things work. Crowley, it wasn't Crowley. There was one writer who said that for planetary workings, you need to work with all the different planets as if they are humors. You need to balance them so you can stay healthy. So, like, if you're a very Saturnian person, you need to work with the sun. You need to work with all of them to balance them out. I believe this is true with the divine masculine and the divine feminine. That's why I think Wicca is really decent. And one of the better ideas in Wicca is that you should work with a god and a goddess to balance yourself out. Crowley argued you should work with spirits that are the opposite of your nature. And it's important to work with things that are opposite to you. So that idea comes from Humeric medicine. Humeric medicine is not scientifically true.
yeah
Anymore. We are not treating people by discovering if they're more choleric or sanguine, right?
and then bleeding them out for it.
Yeah. And was that a belief at the time? Yes. Is it a good spiritual take? Yes. But let's not go back to Humeric medicine. Maybe not, guys.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so it's entirely beholden to like where we are as a society, like where we are as a society politically and sociologically, like what kind of things we value and care about. Like that's what science spends time like researching, and that's also the lens that science approaches the subject matter through. So like of course the results are going to be skewed, and we as individuals have to be mindful of that when we're processing whether something scientific is valuable or not, or whether like something we're doing like our spirituality is irrational just because popular science says that it may not be true. And like that's the other thing I wanted to bring up too today is like another point. I keep referencing shit I learned in school, I'm so sorry, but like there was a research class I had to take where we just had to research the shit out of a topic, and the topic I picked was herbal healing through a scientific lens. And that was the thing, is like for the last like 50 some odd years, give or take, the scientific community has said that herbal healing is mostly bullshit. Like holistic healing doesn't really have anything good to it. And that was just like the assumption, like the blanket statement that the scientific community made, which pushed a lot of that shit into the fringes, like in the New Age movement and like our community nowadays. But within the last couple of years, as holistic medicine has become like more popular and like there's been more money funneled into it, scientists have actually started to study some of it, and they found that like no, like some of these herbs actually do the things that witches say that they do. Like they found that lavender legitimately does reduce your cortisol levels and help you sleep. They found St. John's wort actually does like have antidepressant qualities to it. Like these things, like I'm not saying that science will one day prove magic, but like 30 years ago, science said it was bullshit, and 6 months ago, now they're saying it works. Like science changes just like everything else, and so like you have to use discernment. You have to use good discernment when you're trying to decide if something's valuable or not.
This raises a question, and it's one on our outline, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. In the age of modern science, is it ignorant for people to believe in the supernatural?
I think it depends. I think it depends on your, as a witch, obviously you would think I would say yes, it's fine. But I think that sometimes it depends on why you're turning to that as an answer. Some people jump to it for fear or sometimes from ignorance, but sometimes, as would be the case with us, it's the thing you turn to when nothing else makes sense. There's just no explanation for whatever you've experienced. So it can be ignorance, certainly, but I don't think it's necessarily always or never the case.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Nike there. Like, again, like, as practitioners of the occult, you'd think we'd automatically say, like, believe in the supernatural, but especially after becoming more aware with like the online community and like integrating myself into the online community over the last couple years, I've seen cases where people will use the supernatural as a way to like escape their mental health, or as a way to like escape difficult circumstances, or to bypass like financial difficulty, or to bypass like relationships in your life you don't want to deal with, or just like because you're like a lot of teenagers, just because you're bored and like someone on TikTok told you that like mommy goddess Lilith is going to come help you. Like, there's a billion different ways people can get sucked into this community. And now that I'm more like I feel like my awareness has become more global within our community, I understand the ways it can go wrong now. And so I completely agree with Nike, and I'm going to bring up the word again, like discernment. I think that there is a level of discernment you have to go through if you choose to start opening yourself up to the supernatural, because it can go off the rails so easily. And like, especially with me, like there were periods of like I struggled with mental illness my whole life, and there was a period of time in my teenage years where like I was heavily into substance abuse. I was very mentally unstable, and there were times when like I didn't have a complete like connection to what was real and what was not. And when I was studying occultism in that time, like occultism became a very bad enabler of some very bad behavior during that time. It's very easy to lose connection with reality and rationality when you step into these liminal spaces. And so like discernment is key, like arguably more than someone who doesn't believe in the occult. Like, you have to be skeptical of the paranormal. And like Nike said, like, I only believe in the paranormal if that is the only option that is left to explain what's happening.
For me, I think you should believe in the supernatural because I think it's objectively true. I think that it exists, and I fully believe this. I think that underneath everything, there is the core mystic experience that we are all having, and all the religions are interpretations of that. However, that doesn't mean that everyone talking about the occult is correct. So I believe the occult is correct. I believe the highest form of religion is truth, and I think that if you do not believe in any sort of spirituality, you are actually wrong. But does that mean everyone who does believe in spirituality is correct? No. One, they all contradict themselves, so that creates issues. But anyways, there are people who take advantage of people in our communities, and there are people who do not have a healthy relationship to this stuff, and that is a problem. And for those people, they need to have a very different approach. I think that the occult can be used to make your life mentally worse. I think that it can be hard on certain people, 100%. I think it's true. But that doesn't mean that everyone teaching it or talking about it or experiencing it is doing it in a healthy way, right? Like, we believe water is real, but we're not going to tell people to go get water poisoning because water is real. You know what I mean? It's just, it's kind of absurd. In general, having a healthy relationship to the occult is very, very important. And we stress that very, very hard. Another thing about this idea that like anyone who believes in magic is irrational, there's one aspect of that really bothers me, and that is our relationship to the people of the past. So there's this idea that is implicit with this whole myth of disenchantment thing, that like ancient people, like say the pagans in Greece, which Greece was the beginning of really Western culture. The people who created because these people all talk about, they understand the beauty of Western civilization. And then they think the people that created it, who were deeply spiritual, were stupid, right? There's this big contradiction here, because if you think that anyone who was a Greek pagan is like some irrational nut job who's praying to Sky Daddy, and then you talk about like the values of democracy and the values of all these things that these people stress very heavily, all these people talk about this stuff, does that not contradict? Because you have to understand that ancient people were not stupid, right? Our ancestors were not dumb, right? And they were certainly not dumb for being religious. We've learned more because we've had more time. I think that ancient people, we should realize there weren't, first of all, ancient people were not like more smart than us. They were like ascended masters who knew everything. Like, that approach is wrong. And that approach gets you into weird waters really fast. We're talking about like the ancient civilizations. They were all crazy ascended giants and they were in the 5D. Yet we're not going there, because I don't think that's true either. But they weren't idiots, right? They were just like us, right? If you were born in 2000 AD, you'd still have the same brain, right? You'd still have the same, you'd experience things in the same sort of way, kind of, in the context of that time. You know what I mean? And so I think we should realize that, like, you know, ancient people weren't dumb. People who are religious are not dumb. Being religious does not correlate with having a low IQ or something, right? It doesn't. There are brilliant people who believed in magic and religion. Brilliant ones. Some of the most brilliant people that these exact people who say make it crazy will cite. If you think that every person who believes in spirituality is insane, stop citing a single religious person. Stop citing them. Let's see how long it takes for your like entire framework of belief to just collapse. Because I don't think it would take very long. So that's my sort of little soapbox. The last thing I wanted to talk about just a little bit to sort of wrap up the show. This is going to take a while. It's not exactly a wrap up. We're not closing. We're not at final thoughts. And that would be, why do you believe? Why do we believe? I think that that's an interesting thing to open up.
I would like to hear Georgina's perspective on this, because she was the one that came on and said, like, no, I believe in the paranormal. If you don't believe in the occult, you are wrong. So, like, what gives you that level of conviction? Because I know you weren't raised, like, pagan. Like, you were raised Christian, from what I understand. So, like, even that can bestow a magical mindset. But, like, where did this confidence in the paranormal come from?
Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure if my understanding of it is correct, but I know it's real. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I am not arrogant enough to think that I know how everything works, or the exact metaphysics, or what happens after we die. I don't know that stuff. No. But I think that the occult is real. There's a really good Crowley quote that's, "Argue not, success be thy proof." And so that makes me turn to my personal experiences. I have had multiple experiences that I have experienced with other people in the room, one of them being a hardline atheist, that they saw shit. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
More than one person and I experienced this together, and one was a non-believer. I have had multiple tarot readings come true. I have had astrology play out literally in my life. I have willed things into existence, okay? It has worked for me. I have done these rituals and it has worked.
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, how can I have doubt? Unless I am completely insane, which I don't think is true, considering I've experienced some of this stuff with other people, and I've seen the astrology play out in other people around me's lives. It can't not be true. There has to be truth in it. Do I know for a fact Thelema is the explanation? No, I don't. I could be partially wrong. I could be interpreting things wrong. But I know that that core is there, and that there is something more than this. There are things beyond us, and I am completely certain of this. And I have talked to so many people who have had similar experiences. And once you see some things, you can't turn back from them, okay? Certain things I've experienced, there's no way you can explain that through psychology. You can't. And so for that reason, I mean, success is my biggest argument. Is that the most compelling, like, metaphysical, rational, facts and logic argument? Not really, but it's going to be what convinces you, right? You can sit and read hundreds of books on, like, metaphysics. You sit there and read fucking Hegel, and no one wants to read Hegel, okay? Reading Hegel is like pulling your teeth out and be like, yeah, I understand the phenomenology of spirit or whatever, right? But nothing's going to convince you more than your own life and your own experiences. So if you want to answer the question, is it real? I tell you this. Do the thing. Do it. See what happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's the answer. Do it. If you're so convinced that it's not real, then why are we even having any apprehension about the rituals? You think they're going to do nothing? Right. Then why are you nervous? Just do it. That's my success. Follow the astrology, see what happens. I don't mean read your Cosmo horoscope. I mean, look at real astrology. Do some rituals, meditate for a bit. Invoke a god, evoke a demon, go hard, evoke a demon. And, then you'll know. So figure it out.
That's
Get to
beautiful.
work.
Get to it. Summon your bathroom demon.
If you're so convinced it's not real, why are you scared of the bathroom demon? Okay? Why are you not doing it to prove a point?
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, and then Nike, I know you had a very particular angle you wanted to tackle this from. So where are you coming from?
I'm the same way. Success be thy proof. I have had too many things that I've experienced so literally, and I always turn to astrology because I'm an astrologer at heart. It is what it is. But I've watched the astrology play out like minute by minute, like being able to track exactly when a transit hits this or enters this sign or whatever. Everything is so precise, and you can't even like examples. Not my examples, but examples of Mars entering someone's 4th house and their house burns down. Like 4th house being home and property, Mars being fire, or the moon crosses Mars and they cut themselves, with a kitchen knife or something. That's also another Mars thing. For me, it was that I had a breakup happen when me and my partner, in their chart, the ruler of their 7th house of relationships was in exile in their 1st house, and it had just entered. And at the exact same time, with a different rising sign, with a different rising ruler and everything, I also, at the same time, had my 7th house ruler of relationships exiled in the 1st house. So both of us had a transit that said, the thing that rules relationships for you is in the worst possible spot. Both of us had it at the exact same time, and that's when the breakup happened. Like, it's super literal. The ruler of relationships is doing bad things, therefore your relationship suffers. Both at the same time, breakup happens. Like, stuff like
Wow.
that. Just so much. Like, I just have so many literal examples of astrology, of spell work. I did a money spell, a money bowl. I reactivated my money bowl after months and months of having just let it go to the wayside. And the same day, I went to the dollar store and found a $50 gift card on the ground by my car. No one was parked next to me when I showed up, and I was not in the store long enough for anybody to roll up next to me. It just appeared by my front tire, and I know it wasn't there because I looked down when I got out. Like, it just things like that happen, and it's so weird, and it's so interesting. And the longer I'm in the occult, the less I doubt.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's very similar for me too. And essentially, I have two things that convince me. And the first one is not really good evidence, but it's what initially drew me to the occult. It's just that for whatever fucking reason, this stuff just feels right to me. There's some, and this is what I think Georgina is getting at, is there is a core underneath all of this. I'm not saying witchcraft or thelema or whatever the fuck is the right way, but there is a core underneath it that drew me from a very young age, and it continuously draws me back in different ways. And so that, for one, it just feels right on a level that I can't explain rationally, which is something in and of itself. And then beyond that, over the years of practicing it, so much evidence has just piled up over the years that there was a period of time where I doubted my faith. During the pandemic, I almost completely dropped witchcraft, and I legitimately, I allowed myself to be in that headspace of okay, you are no longer going to believe and practice in this stuff. I got about 5 minutes before I started remembering all of the shit that's ever happened to me. Well, nope, there was that one time, and then that other time, and then that other time, and the other time, and it's just undeniable. There's a level where I can either choose to buy into the paranormal, and it offers some decent explanations for these strange things that have happened to me, or I could choose to ignore it, and then I just have to ignore all of that other bullshit and just chalk it up to strange phenomena or whatever. And for some reason that just doesn't sit right with me. And I think a couple, you gave some specific examples, so some really crazy ones that have happened to me throughout the years. There was a period of time where me and the big one too is when other people, y'all were saying, other people also witnessed the same things. There was a period of time in high school where me and some non-magical friends were just hanging out in the woods, and we got chased by a dog that we all saw and heard, and then it wasn't there 5 seconds later when we turned around. So that was super fucking weird. Another one I can think of is I'm literally sitting right next to one. This freaked my boyfriend out, but I thought it was super cool. So I was reading through J. Allen Cross's book American Brujeria, and he reminded me of this very cool little road opener spell. And the idea is basically a novena candle spell. It's just a road opener, but I had never heard of this concept before. So when you burn a novena candle, sometimes it can do some weird stuff, and one of the things it does is it can leave ash streaks or the black smoke residue all throughout the candle. And that's what Joshua was talking about in his book, is if you're doing a road opener spell and the candle burns all the way down and there's a bunch of black soot built up in the candle, it could mean that you need to do another one, and it should be a gauge for how much crap needs to be cleansed out of the situation. So I did the first road opener. I wish you could see this better, but the first road opener is completely black. After that burned down, I did a second one. The second one, only the top is black, and then I did a third one the next day after that, and it's completely clear. And in that time, and in that time frame too, I got my tax return back, which I have had to owe about $500 on my taxes every year for the last 5 years because I'm self-employed, and now I don't. Like, I actually got money back from the government, which I don't know how the fuck that happened. Like, we just, like, all these different opportunities have been rolling in out of the blue for the last week. Like, my mental health has been doing well, which is fucking crazy. And so, like, the spell worked, and I got a really cool, like, synchronicity to demonstrate that. And so, like, shit like that just keeps happening. And until it stops happening, maybe I'll become more skeptical, but, like, until it stops happening, that is my proof.
So, my final thoughts are that The Myth of Disenchantment, first of all, I suggest reading the book. It's very good. But in general, religion is not dead. Spirituality is not dead, and God is most certainly not dead. As much as Christopher Hitchens might want him to be, he's not. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, religion and spirituality is one of the most important parts of culture and human experience. And I think as people, we internally crave it. I think that we want something more. And, there is more than one framework, right? Going to church is not the only way to experience this stuff. And I suggest to anyone listening to go out and experience it and, do the rituals and draw your own conclusions and know that no, science and magic are not contradictions. You don't need to pick one. I don't think any dichotomies are real. And this is another example of why I think dichotomy is a lie. There is no dichotomies. It's bullshit. Nuance will always rise to the top.
My final thoughts are I don't really care if others believe is my honest opinion, but I think I'm at a point in my life now where I will never not believe because I've seen too much, and as time goes on, it only becomes a stronger belief, which I know can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I came from a skeptical mindset. For any of you who don't know, if you're new to the show, I grew up atheistically. I did not grow up with religion. I did not believe until I was an adult, actually. My parents never tried to push religion on me. I was raised without religion, and I stumbled into paganism as a skeptic, being very psych model, and became spirit model and became a full believer from my own experiences. I wanted to be skeptical. I wanted to be disproven. Essentially, I wanted to prove that not that I was actively trying to prove it, but I wanted to see proof that this wasn't actually real. But so much kept happening and so much kept proving itself that I don't think I can ever go back. I am now fully entrenched in it. And it really just does come down to experience. Try the damn thing out. See what happens. You're allowed to try to do it to disprove it. But for me, trying to disprove it did the opposite effect. So I think that the myth and sorry, excuse me. I think the myth of disenchantment is entirely wrong. Or like I believe that disenchantment is a myth, I should say. Disenchantment is a myth. I think that we live in a magical world. The magic has never gone away. People are just finding new ways to experience it. And in that sense, it's shifting. It might be moving away from formal religions and formal power structures and hierarchies of religions, but magical belief and spiritual belief has never gone away, and I don't think it ever will.
I think my final thoughts are going to be I'm in the same camp as Nike. I think I'm at a point in my life where I couldn't not believe, but for anyone out there, like I know that there are a lot, especially for beginners in the craft, like there is a lot out there to tell you otherwise, that like the paranormal is not real, everything we're doing is fake, like blah blah blah. And by a larger extent, the myth of disenchantment, like we live in a de-magical world. And I touched on a little bit, like the reason that I initially was drawn to the occult is because there was just something about it that drew me on some type of intrinsic, subconscious, maybe metaphysical level. It just felt right to me. And throughout a lot of my life, coming from like a Catholic background and a very scientific family, like there was a lot of pushback within my own psyche and from external sources. And I had to grapple with the idea of like, am I crazy for believing in all this stuff many times? And so throughout my life, like I said, I'm at a point now where I don't deal with that as much so much. But if you are at a point where you're dealing with that, I just urge you to question the narratives that are popular. Like we've discussed a lot in this episode, science has its own agenda. Popular mainstream culture has its own agenda. It can go into racial politics, class dynamics, like any number of things. Like there's a billion reasons why you are fed the reality that you are fed, and you are fed a reality. And so if you genuinely feel some type of way, especially about the paranormal, since we're a paranormal podcast, you owe it to yourself to figure out what is actual fact, what are just popular narratives, and then come, like Georgina said, come to that nuanced approach for yourself.
Patrons, we get to thank you every other week now, every show. We get to thank you every show for helping to support us. So if you're the bud tier or higher, you get an extra special shout out by name. So extra special shout out to we have a bunch of you new guys here. Winebearer, Victoria, the Lady Ghost, Pamela, Nicole, Neva, Neon, Nauseated, MK Scorpio 89, Mike Middle, cut that, Mike, Marshall, Marcello, Lilith, Leo, Lee, Freighter Zygmunt, Doitsu, Dot Nihilus, Corvus, Cirrus, Brigid, Boxy, Anna, Angry Pratt, Allie, Alejandra, A Sociology of Tarot. That was terrible. A Sociology of Tarot. Robin, not our Robin, a different Robin. Lita, Jonah, Hamda, Evan, and Amy Momster. Thanks, guys.
And if you want to support us, you get extra shows, extended shows, pre-shows, video versions, a lot of things. We also allegedly do extra episodes. Maybe. Asterisk. Potentially. Theoretically. They may exist, they may not. Just like the myth of disenchantment. May exist or may not. But if you want to find me, I'm Georgina Rose or .darling, DAAT. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and Telegram. I'm technically on Odyssey and Vero, but I don't really do things there. And you can support me on Patreon or Ko-Fi.
My name is Nike. You can find me at Warrior Witch Nike basically everywhere. I've been taking a break recently because of my move, but once I move, I plan to jump back in. But you can find me on places like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Twitch. We stream every Monday, Wednesday, or most Monday, Wednesdays. You know, that sort of thing.
Something like that.
Something like that. Basically everywhere. And on Twitter, I'm Astro Witch Nike.
And I am Anthony. You can find me at Anthony the Witch on Instagram and Twitter. I'm hoping to branch into some more apps very soon, like I keep saying every week. But I promise there are content plans coming down the road. So if you'd like to come hang out, I promise there will be some fun stuff to do in the near future.
And this has been Magnolias and Magic.